Hey there, welcome to 2.14, which is all about cystic fibrosis. So first of all, linking to the previous spec point, the genetics of cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. Okay, so obviously we draw recessive alleles as lowercase. So you might think it makes sense to draw the genetics out with C's, because C for cystic fibrosis, but generally we don't use C's because if we look at the capital and the lowercase, they kind of look the same, and if you do them too similar, then you can't tell which one's which. Okay, so try not to use C because the examiner might not be able to see what you mean. So F is fine because the capital letter and the lowercase letter look quite different, so that's a good one to use. So cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele, which is obviously this one, and you need two copies of it to be expressed. So you need to have the genotype lowercase f lowercase f, and we call that homozygous because they're the same, recessive because obviously it's the lowercase. Okay, so you'll have cystic fibrosis if you're homozygous, recessive if you have little f, little f. Now, we call, I'll just put here cystic fibrosis. Now, if you have capital F, lowercase f, so if you have a dominant and a recessive, obviously you don't have cystic fibrosis, but there's another level of detail that we need to talk about. We need to actually say that you're called a carrier. Okay, so you're not going to have any symptoms, you're going to be normal, as we call it, but you are going to be a carrier because you're carrying this recessive allele that causes cystic fibrosis, but you're not going to suffer from it because you've also got the normal one there. So that genotype is called heterozygous. So making sure we're using the language. So the genotype here is homozygous recessive, and the phenotype is cystic fibrosis. The genotype here is heterozygous, and the phenotype is a carrier. If you had, therefore, capital F, we would call that genotype homozygous dominant, and the phenotype would be just called normal. Okay, so how do you inherit cystic fibrosis? So we know that to have cystic fibrosis, we need two lowercase alleles. So one of those must have come from the mother, and one of those must have come from the father. Okay, so father, mother. Now, most likely the mother will have been normal, the father will have been normal, so both of them would have been heterozygous, and therefore the genetic cross looks like this. So if you've got two parents that are heterozygous, then there's a 1 in 4 chance of the offspring having cystic fibrosis. Okay. It is possible, of course, that one of the parents was homozygous recessive, but as we'll see in a minute, actually cystic fibrosis affects the reproductive system as well, so it's quite unlikely. The next thing to have a look at is what then happens. So we've talked about a little bit already how cystic fibrosis is when we have a mutation in the gene for the CFTR protein. Okay, so the CFTR protein stands for cystic fibrosis, as you might expect. That's the easy bit. The next bit's really hard because it doesn't even match the letters. So the T is transmembrane. And then we've got conductance, which we don't even have a letter for. Regulator protein. Okay, so CFTR. Okay, so cystic fibrosis, transmembrane conductance regulator. So what it's doing is it's regulating the conductance of stuff across a membrane. Okay, so it's go through the words again. It's regulating or controlling the conductance, how stuff moves across the the membrane. So it's regulating the movement across a membrane. All right. So in our cell membranes, we know that we've got this phospholipid bilayer. We know that we've got proteins that sometimes go all the way through and help to control the movement of stuff across the membrane. So the CFTR is effectively one of these. All right, so for this spec point, we're not worried about the detail of how that protein works, but we're interested in the symptoms of what happens to somebody with cystic fibrosis. So let's type it in. You can read it nice and clearly. So first of all, the overview of it is that you get this really thick, sticky mucus, and that thick, sticky mucus is the problem in all parts of the body where it causes a problem. The kind of cause of it is this really thick, sticky mucus, where it shouldn't be that thick. It shouldn't be that sticky. Okay, the reason why the mucus is so thick and sticky is because it doesn't have enough water in it. And that's because of this CFTR protein disrupting the movement of molecules across the membrane, and therefore not enough water in the right places to make this mucus the right consistency. So we get this really thick, sticky mucus because it's not got enough water in. The next thing is to look at where in the body this then causes a problem. So the first place that it causes the problem, and the most kind of common symptom, is in the respiratory system, where it affects your lungs. So let's have a look at the problem with having really thick, sticky mucus in our lungs, in our respiratory system. So we need mucus in our respiratory system, in our lungs, because the mucus acts as a trap for things like dust, bacteria, etc. And it stops these things that we don't want in our lungs from going all the way down to our lungs. So obviously, when we breathe in, let's put here that mucus is needed to stop lung infection. So when we breathe in, if we draw a diagram of our lungs, the air initially goes through this tube here, which we call the trachea. The air then goes down these bronchi here, and then the bronchi divide into smaller tubes called bronchioles, and then on the end of those, no room for the S on the end, and then into the air sacs called the alveoli. So as we breathe in, let's finish the diagram. I'll just draw one side so I don't take all day doing the drawing. So we've got the air sacs on the end. They're little bunches of grapes, aren't they? Okay. So as we breathe in and the air goes down and through here, there is some mucus in these tubes, and the mucus is needed to stop infection because we don't want dust and dirt and microbes going all the way down to our alveoli and causing infections in our lungs down here. So we've got mucus all the way from in our nose, all the way down, stopping those infections. So the mucus is really, really important to have as the right consistency in the kind of tubes on the way down to our lungs. And also we need some mucus in our alveoli, but not to be too thick, because otherwise it kind of makes an even thicker barrier, if you like, for the oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across to get into the bloodstream. Okay, so mucus is needed to stop lung infections, as it traps the dust, microorganisms, etc., before they go into the lungs and cause infections. So once the mucus has trapped some dust or microbes or whatever, as you breathe in, we then try to move this mucus up out of our lungs, away from our alveoli, using something called cilia. So the cilia are little extensions on the edge of the cells that are lining the airways. If I was to draw a normal cell, you might draw it like that. If I was to draw a ciliated cell, it's got these little projections coming out of one side, almost like little hairs coming out one side. And these little cilia here can waft back and forth to move the mucus up and down. So the lining of these airways has got ciliated epithelial cells, which have these little cilia sticking out from them, little extensions that can waft the mucus up to your mouth, and you can either swallow it down to your stomach or you can spit it out, whatever. But it stops anything bad from going down into our alveoli. So the cilia then waft the mucus away from the lungs. All right, so that's how a healthy person would protect their lungs. Now, what happens when the mucus becomes too thick and sticky is that the cilia can't move the mucus out. So, in cystic fibrosis sufferers, the mucus is so thick that the cilia can't move the mucus out of the lungs. So, there is an increased risk of infection, first of all. So the microbes don't get wafted out. They continue on down to the lungs because we can't get the mucus out. And we start to get more infections. The other thing is that the mucus can then start to line the alveoli. So if the mucus lines the alveoli, the mucus is in the alveoli, it increases the diffusion distance, oxygen and carbon dioxide have to move between the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. Okay, so we know that if I was to draw an alveoli zoomed in, something like this, we know that around the alveoli we've got our blood capillary. We know that the alveoli is adapted by having a wall that's one cell thick. The capillary is adapted by having a wall that's one cell thick. We've got the oxygen diffusing into the blood, and we've got the carbon dioxide diffusing back into the alveoli. So now we've got mucus here. There's a larger distance for these gases to diffuse across, so it's harder for gas exchange to occur. Okay. The other thing is that the mucus is blocking the airways, making it harder for for you to breathe the oxygen in to get down to your lungs as well. Okay, so when the thick mucus is in the alveoli, it increases the diffusion distance. The oxygen and carbon dioxide have to move between the alveoli and the blood. And mucus also blocks the airways, making it harder to get oxygen into the lungs. Okay, so obviously it's a bad thing for your lungs, isn't it? It's really bad for getting oxygen. So someone with cystic fibrosis is likely to have a wheeze, so you can kind of almost hear a whistling as they're trying to breathe because the air is trying to squeeze through these really thin tubes because they're blocked with mucus. It's going to be really hard for them to breathe. It's going to be hard to get enough oxygen for the cells to get enough energy, etc. So if you have cystic fibrosis, you're likely to be put onto antibiotics because you're going to have such regular lung infections. So you're likely to take antibiotics every day. They can also give you some medicine to try and thin the mucus in the lungs, and you're likely to have a massage type physiotherapy of your lungs daily to try and shift some of the mucus out. Okay, so let's make a note of the treatments. box a bit bigger. So we're going to have antibiotics, some medication to try and thin the mucus, and physiotherapy, which is like a massage to move the mucus out of the lungs. Okay, so it's a very, very intense treatment program that you'd have if you have cystic fibrosis. You know, it would affect your daily life, you know, spending a lot of time, you know, in your room on your own, probably going through these motions to try and just keep yourself breathing well enough to survive, really. The next system that cystic fibrosis affects is your digestive system. So, in your digestive system, again, the problem is this thick, sticky mucus. That's always going to be the cause of the problems. So, the main problem now is that this thick, sticky mucus is going to block the little tubes that are delivering the enzymes to your intestines. Okay, tubes that deliver enzymes to intestines. And as a result, you can't digest your food properly because you don't have the enzymes. Right? And obviously, if you can't digest your food, then the little molecules that it gets broken down into don't diffuse into the blood, don't go to the cells for respiration. Again, you're going to be short of energy. Um, so you're going to have to be really careful with what you eat because you're going to be able to digest certain foods better than others. It's often a case that you can digest lipids really well. It affects digestion of lipids, so you can't digest the lipids very well. So you're just going to need to be really careful what you eat. Now, having all the mucus causes something called cysts to grow in the pancreas. And that's where the name cyst in cystic fibrosis actually comes from, which is interesting. Okay, so the excess mucus in the pancreas causes polyps. Oh, they're also called polyps. Should call them cysts. Cysts makes more sense in this context because it's cystic fibrosis. So excess mucus, we should say, causes cysts develop in the pancreas, hence the name cystic fibrosis. Okay. Um, as a treatment for this, then, what you would need is basically to take the digestive enzymes in tablet form. Okay, so tablets containing digestive enzymes. All right, so we're not going to be able to digest our food very well because these little tubes delivering enzymes into our digestive system are blocked. So let me just show you in a kind of diagram form. So when we swallow our food, it goes down our esophagus into our stomach, from our stomach down into our small intestines, gone off the bottom now, then into our large intestines, which goes around here. Okay. Now, when the food is going from the stomach into the small intestines, that's where most of the enzymes are sort of delivered. So your food doesn't go through your pancreas, but your pancreas is a sort of leaf shape behind here. And we've got a tube that's going to deliver the enzymes from the pancreas into the tube where your food's going through. So as your food, if this is your pancreas, let me label that in case anyone's not sure. So as your food goes from your stomach, which is here, to your small intestine, which is down here, enzymes are delivered from your pancreas through this little tube here. It's called a duct. So this little tube here is called a duct, and that's what's going to get blocked with the mucus. So you can see if there's enzymes that are made in the pancreas that need to be delivered into here, if that tube is blocked, the enzymes simply can't get through. Now we've also got another part here, which is called your gallbladder, which stores your bile for digesting fats, and then you've got the little duct that joins that onto our digestive system, and that gets blocked as well, hence not having the enzymes, not being able to digest our food. All right, so hopefully that's just a bit more visual. The third system that it affects is the reproductive system. So in your reproductive system, it's a very similar problem really to your digestive system, because it's this thick, sticky mucus again, blocking tubes, blocking ducts, not letting things go where they need to go. Okay, so it's the thick, sticky mucus blocks ducts, which is another name for tubes. So reproduction is really difficult. So obviously it's quite just slightly different in males and females. So in females, first of all, let's do females first. The mucus is really thick and sticky, as we know, and sometimes that mucus blocks the cervix, and therefore it's really hard for the sperm to actually get through. Okay, so the cervix is blocked. It's hard for the sperm to enter the uterus. If we're not sure where the cervix is, let's just make sure we're clear. So, female reproductive system. So, make sure we know parts. So this is the uterus in here, which when you're younger you would have called the womb. Then we've got the ovaries here, where the eggs come from. The ovary duct here, little tube where the egg comes from the ovary into the uterus. The vagina here. And in between the uterus and the vagina is a ring of muscle there, which is called the cervix. And it's in the cervix there that we've got this thick mucus. So even if the sperm get into here, they can't get into the uterus. They can't join with the egg, so it's very hard to get pregnant. We say that it reduces the sperm's motility. So the sperm are obviously trying to swim, trying to move, and it's really hard for them to move through the thick mucus. Okay, as it reduces the sperm. All right. In males, slightly different, obviously, because we've got a different reproductive system. So in males, it's again a tube that gets blocked, and this time it's the tube that joins where the sperm are produced in the testes to where the sperm get released. So the sperm are still made, but it's hard for them to get released. So it's the tube that joins the testes where the sperm are made to where they are released. So obviously it's hard for the sperm to get out, so it's hard to get pregnant or to make somebody pregnant to have children. So fertility obviously reduced in both males and females that have cystic fibrosis. Okay, that brings us to the end of that spec point. Another one done.